For this final session of day one of the Future of the American Child training, we're going to continue the conversation of the impact of COVID on children and youth. One of the interesting phenomena, or troubling phenomena, I should say, that has happened is that the quarantining and the homeschooling was an experiment and a challenge in and of itself. But we've reached a point in history where we realize that so many of the children who left school because of COVID did not return. So our next speaker is Thomas Dee. He is the Barnett Family Professor at the Stanford University Graduate School of Education. He and his colleagues undertook extensive research into that cohort of children who simply did not return to the classroom after the quarantines were lifted and the bans sort of ended. So I think it's important for us, those of us who at any point have ever covered education or want to cover education, to hear the information that Professor Dee has to share with us. And certainly I think it'll provide us all with the needed context that we must have. So Thomas Dee, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you for having me. And I hope you can hear me well and view the slides. And let me say at the beginning, I'm sorry not to be there in person with you, but hope this will be a close substitute. I wanted to contextualize what we're discussing today by just orienting us to where we are. It was just over 3 years ago, the World Health Organization declared we were in a pandemic, noting it's not just a public health crisis, but a crisis that will touch every sector. And that has surely been borne out in the labor market, where we still have a sustained run-up in hybrid work from home employment, and is particularly striking in education, where I'm going to argue we've had really sustained and important effects that even in this day, we don't fully understand to the extent we should. And this is kind of a propitious moment because just recently, the World Health Organization announced we're no longer in a public health emergency of international concern, which is actually a kind of somewhat technical term of art they use. And the White House is about to announce a similar change of status for the US. I think this is perhaps somewhat falsely being misunderstood publicly as the official pandemic is over. I'm not sure that's the characterization they would actually offer. But I want to stress again, I think this is an important pivotal moment because, at least in education, we are clearly seeing important and long-lived effects of the pandemic that I think merit our policy attention and also create a really compelling need for journalistic coverage, both through narrative and data. Okay, so I want to set this up with two really broad questions that will orient the comments I have today. So one is, what do we know about the effect of the pandemic on students' learning opportunities and their development? And two, are our academic recovery efforts adequately meeting the current challenge? And within this broader set of questions, the work I and my colleagues particularly have been doing, as Rachel mentioned, has been to provide what I think are really important and novel insights into both of these questions from the early collection and analysis of enrollment data. But I want to begin first to contextualize this by talking about what we currently know about the mental well-being of our young adults. Sorry, Carlos, I think you need to be on mute so I don't get that feedback. And I lead with this because it's more common to stress the learning loss, which I'm going to discuss, but I think it's important to lead with the mental health evidence because sometimes I'll hear from colleagues, yeah, test scores are down, maybe that's an issue, but our kids have survived through the pandemic, they've shown resiliency, and people will often trot out the old saw about what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But there's very serious evidence of a youth mental health crisis. We've seen that in how the American Academy of Pediatrics and some partner organizations declared it a national emergency and youth mental health, and the US Surgeon General issued a rare public health advisory on this point and has been discussing it quite a bit. Now, let me give you a flavor of some of the underlying evidence for this. There are several indicators of youth mental health that have deteriorated during the pandemic. And as I look at these, I haven't seen this stressed as much, particularly among girls. But also, I think it's important to recognize there were pre-pandemic trends in deteriorating youth mental health that I think we're going to be continuing to discuss extensively that appear to reflect other factors such as the growth of social media and its psychological impact. But just to give you a flavor of this, this is from a survey of high school students in the US. We're currently in a position where nearly 3 in 5 teen girls claim they felt persistently sad or hopeless in 2021. And you can see the trend data in the graph on the right. Just between 2019 and 2021, there was a 10 percentage point increase from 47% to 57%. So that's roughly a 20% increase. But you can also see that particularly for girls, it was growing throughout the last decade, which is part of that larger context that really matters. We're also seeing surveys of schools reporting sharp run-ups in students seeking mental health services. More than 2/3 of public schools reported such increases, and we could see that they're larger in schools serving high poverty neighborhoods and in both urban and rural schools, and a little higher in larger schools as well. Another striking indicator, this graph, let me orient this to you a little bit, but this was some of the most discussed evidence, was how there appear to be increased emergency room visits for suspected suicide attempts among adolescents, and this appears to be particularly sharp among girls. So to orient you to this graph, this is showing ER visits for suspected suicide attempts among girls aged 12 to 17 by the week of the year. And the finely dotted line is showing that for 2019. And then the thicker dotted line is showing that for the first year of the pandemic, 2020. And we could see as we went into shutdown around week 13, 14, 15, suicide visits to ER understandably dropped and then rose again later in the year. But then this top dark line is taking us into 2021, where we're seeing a really dramatic run up in these ER visits for teen girls, to the point where it's almost double what it was in the pre-pandemic period. So really strong indicators of mental distress among youth. And there are other data, just in the interest of brevity, I haven't included, about trends in suspected self-poisonings, which among 10 to 12-year-olds actually grew 70%, I think it is, during the pandemic. And these are all available from the CDC and their monthly morbidity and mortality reports. Another indicator that's sometimes used when schools discuss social emotional learning is chronic absenteeism. There's been a movement in school accountability to include social emotional measures, but many of the survey measures aren't really quite up to snuff. So what a lot of states have done is they've turned to chronic absenteeism as just a crude measure of the degree to which students are engaging in school. And we've seen there's very recent data suggesting there have been substantial problems with attendance, substantial run-ups in chronic absenteeism. And this really appears to correlate, this hasn't been super well documented yet, but appears to correlate with the return to in-person instruction. So to illustrate this, I'm showing this with just 2 states, California and North Carolina. California is in blue here, and we could see, we don't have data for 2019, it's not well defined, but we could see as we move to 2021, when California largely remained with remote only learning, chronic absenteeism went up, but not by a lot. But in the 21-22 school year, when we returned to in-person instruction, it more than doubled. The chronic absenteeism rate, which is defined as missing 10% or more of school days, was under 15% in 2021 and closer to 10% for the pandemic. It's fully 30% in California for the 21-22 school year. And in red, we have North Carolina, which was a little earlier in returning to in-person instruction. And we see their dramatic run up, almost the doubling from 15 to over 25% to now over 30% over this period. So this is an extraordinary and unprecedented run up in students simply not being present in school. And, um, and obviously that's important for their intellectual development and is a serious barrier to all the varied efforts we're undertaking at academic recovery. And I think this is still, to some extent, an underreported story. Okay, so with all that, the background in youth mental health issues, the background in sort of an abortive attempt to re-engage in pre-pandemic patterns of instruction, what do we know about how students are actually learning? Well, we have seen this really troubling portrait about setbacks in learning, and it has really important implications for students' well-being economically, in terms of their health, in terms of their future as engaged citizens. It has implications for economic growth and for inequality. And perhaps the best evidence of this comes from the NAEP. If you're familiar with this, the National Assessment of Educational Progress is commonly called the nation's report card and has been tracking data for decades among US school students. And data were released for 2022 in math and reading last fall. And just last week, I'm sorry, whoever's advancing my slides went ahead too far, I think. There you go. Just last week, new history and civics results were released that also showed declines. But the math and reading decline data came out last fall. And as you could see in the graph, there were really quite dramatic declines. So grade 4 math fell to a scale score of 236. And to put that in perspective, that wipes out nearly 2 decades of progress. We're back to where we were in 2003. And similarly for grade 8, we had like an 8-point decline in math achievement. And so that also takes us back more than 20 years. And it's always this question about how do we frame scale score declines in a test? Well, one common way to do this is to note that these kinds of declines, for example, the decline in grade 8 math, is equivalent to close to a full school year in learning, right? Between a half and a full school year. And if we were to map forward the implications for lifetime earnings, there's evidence that this is close to a 6% decline. So really serious economic effects for students of this, and also implications for inequality, because the trajectories in trend have what sometimes you'll hear called K-shaped trajectories, where they're not going down or may even be going up for more affluent kids and for white students, but we're seeing bigger losses among lower income students as well as Black and Hispanic students. Now, one note of caution I want to insert here, though, these are the national data. And so they're a good benchmark. But sometimes you'll see people discussing state data changes or even local district changes. And I think you want to interpret those with great caution because of the churn I'm going to describe in enrollment. There's been such a substantial exodus from public schools and increased mobility throughout the country during the pandemic that many state and local comparisons are really, to some extent, vexed by those changes. And just anecdotally, I've seen some school superintendents crowing about the fact that, hey, for certain groups that were historically underserved, they were actually seeing increases in achievement during the pandemic. But when you looked more closely, you saw that 20% of that population left during the pandemic. So there's really more of a selection phenomenon than an indicator. So just a note of caution as you see data at a more granular level from test scores. Okay, so with that as a bit of a teaser, let's get into talking about public school enrollment. I've been arguing that the changes we've seen in public school enrollment are a really valuable leading indicator. In particular, in the early part of the pandemic, many of the data systems we would commonly use around testing or attendance became problematic. Students weren't sitting for tests in the same way. Their formats changed, they were remote, not everyone participated, attendance became harder to collect and inaccurate, but the enrollment data was more objective, universally available, and available very quickly. And also that universality is really important because think of all the mental health and testing data I just described. They really focus on older students. Most testing doesn't begin till grade 3. And the mental health data tends also to focus on middle school and high school students. So those data, valuable though they are, tell us little about how the pandemic may have been influencing our youngest learners. Yet what I'm going to show you is that the enrollment disruptions were really the largest among those younger learners who even as of today have not yet aged into our testing windows. Okay, and so let's say a little bit more about the educational disruptions implied by changes in public school enrollment. One, it suggests that there are reactive switches to private and homeschooling. And I put the emphasis on reactive because there's a research literature that says that school switching can harm student learning when it's not planned, when it's done in reaction to unanticipated external events. But in contrast, if, hey, we've decided to move to this other community, our family has better jobs, or we're moving closer to family, that doesn't appear to be as harmful as, oh, something unexpected happened and we've had to undertake a switch. So as it had during the pandemic. So those reactive switches to other schooling can be disruptive. Second, drops in enrollment tell us about truancy and dropping out, or when it's occurring among younger kids, that they may be simply skipping kindergarten in states where that's allowed and not going at all and advancing to first grade, or redshirting themselves and delaying kindergarten. Now, the other critical implication, and we're going to want to say more about this, is public school enrollment declines imply a long-term fiscal threat to public school districts and an implied pressure to maybe close under-enrolled schools and possibly lay off staff. So I'll have more to say about that shortly. But let's step back for a moment and discuss what are the major patterns in public school enrollment. To get at this, we had to go ahead and sort of collect the data ourselves. You can move ahead to the next slide if you'd like. And so I worked in collaboration with some data journalists here at Stanford who are part of big local news, with colleagues at the New York Times and other outlets such as EdSource. And we wanted to get these enrollment data, but the federal government aggregates them from states that get it from their districts and was lagging in reporting the national enrollment data. So we undertook an effort to go state by state, collect, clean, and harmonize their data on K through 12 public school enrollment, in advance of that lagging federal reporting. And what we saw is at the K through 12 level, in the first full school year after the pandemic, public schools lost over 1 million students. There are roughly 50 million students in public schools at the K through 12 level. So that was a decline of just over 2%. And this was in 2021 on the front page of the Sunday New York Times in August, underscoring what I'll show you more shortly about the grade-specific patterns. But just to give you a flavor on the next slide of how historically unprecedented this was, I'm showing you here year-to-year percent changes in national K through 12 school enrollment. And we could see year-to-year, historically, those changes were modest, less than 0.5%. What happened in the first full school year under the pandemic, fall 2020? We dropped to here with over a 2% decline, that loss of 1.1 million students. Now, if in the next year, as places started to return, most did, to in-person instruction, we might have expected it to bounce above the horizontal axis by an equal amount, but that didn't occur. In fact, there was a very modest but further decline in K through 12 enrollment, suggesting that those students didn't return. Okay, what do we know about where they went? Well, as the headline in the New York Times intimated, we saw these declines were particularly big in kindergarten, where fall enrollment in 2020 fell by 9%. And it was also quite large in those elementary school grades, and much more modest in middle school and high school grades. And We also saw those kindergarten reductions were larger in poorer and urban communities and appeared to be much larger in districts that offered remote only schooling. But we took up that last question in a more serious kind of analytical way. Did choosing remote only instruction really contribute to this disenrollment? And this is a question that's appropriate today as we have a frankly highly politicized kind of Monday morning quarterbacking of the decisions we made about school closures in the early parts of the pandemic. So I'm going to show you evidence shortly from an academic study where we engage this question. But let me contextualize it a little more. In fall 2020, most public school students, nearly 60%, experienced remote-only instruction, while 24% were in person and the residual were in some kind of hybrid. Again, we have this continued debate about the wisdom of those school closures, and it's a debate that may again become relevant if we have further challenges. So we want to understanding the effects of those closures begins with understanding its impact on enrollment. And our peer-reviewed study, which is now forthcoming, provides quasi-experimental evidence on how school closures influence district enrollment. By quasi-experimental I mean we're using experimental-like research designs that allow us to make claims about the causal impact of school closures. And so let me unpackage that a little bit in a non-technical way. Basically, we tracked at the school district level K through 12 enrollment from the 2015-16 school year into the first full school year under the pandemic, 2020-2021. And across districts that in that last year offered either remote only, hybrid, or in-person instruction. So let's dial forward, starting everyone at a common index of 100 for fall 2015, and track how enrollment was moving across these district groups over this period. So as we go forward over time, to the point where we're on the eve of the pandemic, we're seeing something interesting. There were pre-existing trends across these districts. The top line are the districts that are going to adopt in-person instruction in 2020 during the pandemic. The very bottom line, the dark ones, are the ones that are going to offer remote-only instruction. So what's going on here? Well, there were these pre-existing trends because the remote-only districts, which were more likely to be urban, were experiencing some modest disenrollment even before the pandemic began. And the other districts, which tend to be more suburban, were seeing enrollment increases even before they decided to remain in person. And so our research design needed to reckon with separating out the impact of the decision made in the final year with this pre-existing trend. And fundamentally it involves, we want to subtract off that half percentage point year difference in growth rates across these two groups. Okay, now let's fast forward to the pandemic year. What do we see? Well, enrollment declines everywhere, but it was a particularly sharp decline in the remote-only districts. So there's about if you compare remote-only to in-person districts, the remote-only districts fell by 1.3 percentage points more in enrollment. But again, our designs suggest about half of that percentage point is due to pre-existing trends that would have occurred regardless of what decision they made. So we want to net that out from that 1.3 and argue basically the effect is something like 0.8 of a percentage point, roughly 1 percentage point when we do that. So again, our quasi-experimental study suggests remote-only instruction contributed substantially to disenrollment, because remember, overall enrollment fell by 2% nationally, but it was roughly a percentage point higher, so roughly 42% higher, that is, in states that decided, or districts that decided to go remote only. And so of that 1.1 million enrollment decline nationally, we estimate that among the districts that chose to go remote, the impact of that decision was to explain about a quarter of that decline. 300,000 students left public schools because their districts chose to remote only instruction. Now, we also see heterogeneity by grade level. The negative effects were particularly large for kindergarten students and to a lesser extent, the somewhat older elementary school students. And we don't really see evidence that it impacted enrollment at the middle school and high school level. So what are we learning here? Well, we're learning something about the revealed preferences, particularly among parents with young kids. Parents of older kids weren't necessarily as concerned about them sitting in front of a laptop for instruction to the extent they'd be willing to find some alternative. But for parents with really young kids, perhaps understandably, they didn't want to sit them in front of a computer all day. And so if they could, they found alternative accommodations. And I'll say more about where those kids went shortly. That's been the subject of my more recent work. But basically, for parents with young kids, concern about remote instruction dwarfed the concerns, perhaps about the health risks that they might have faced. Okay, so let's turn to this question now, though, about where these kids went. And this has been the subject of my recent research that came out that I've done collaboratively, again, with big local news here at Stanford and colleagues at the Associated Press. They rolled out that reporting in February. I'll share links to all of this, by the way, at the end of the talk. So we know kids left. There's this historically unprecedented exodus from public school. Where did they go? And so up until the last few months, the evidence we've had on this has been surprisingly limited. And what we did know was quite enigmatic. And as an aside, I would express frustration with the data systems available to us. I think the pandemic has really called out how inadequate our data systems are. If you were to go to federal reporting today, you would not find evidence on private school enrollment or homeschool enrollment that's more recent than the 2019 pre-pandemic period. And what we could see in the public enrollment data, there was no rebound in grade 1 or grade 2 enrollment. And the National Catholic School Association reported their enrollment actually fell over this period as well. And they're the major private school system. There was some early evidence from the early period of the pandemic from an experimental census survey that showed a pretty substantial increase in homeschooling, but nothing about whether that homeschooling increase sustained. So we have an enigma. The kids didn't come back to public school. We didn't see an increase in Catholic school enrollment. We didn't know necessarily what has been going on with homeschooling. So we, through this collaboration, again, ahead of federal schooling, went to every state to see if we could get private school enrollment data, homeschool enrollment data, and also I put together data, census data on the school age population by state to try to track where students have gone. What could explain the public school enrollment declines? Okay, what were the key results? Well, first, we were able to collect data from 21 states and DC. It covers about half the school age kids in the US. We find that declines in the school age population explain a pretty substantial part of the public school enrollment loss, around 26%. And there have been, there's some national declines in the US in the school age population due to declining birth rate, due to declines in immigration. But also we see that there was substantial domestic migration during the pandemic that reflects things like the rise of work from home, labor force engagement, drivers from housing costs that led people to reshuffle around the country. And that demographic change explains a lot of the local variation in public school enrollment loss. Here's a little scatter plot from an op-ed I wrote for Education Week that discusses this. So the horizontal axis is the percent change in school age population during the pandemic, and the vertical axis is the percent change in public school enrollment. So we see, for example, a state like New York lost a particularly large amount of its school age population, around 2%, and was also a state where the public school enrollment declines were quite large, around 5%, rather well above twice the US average of 2%. And California is another state in this area. And then as you go to other states, you just see a one-to-one fit here. The places that didn't lose as much school age population didn't lose as much public school enrollment. So this domestic reshuffling is definitely part of the public school enrollment loss that we're seeing varying across states and across communities. Now, going to the next slide, what did we see about private school enrollment change? We're seeing that private school enrollment did grow over this period, around 4% between 2019 and the 21-22 school years, but it explains a relatively modest amount of the public school enrollment decline, around 14%. And in contrast, we saw surprisingly large and sustained growth in homeschool enrollment into the 21-22 school year, when public schools were largely back in person. The growth over that period was around 30%. So that's a big change, but it's a percent change off a small base. But even in terms of absolute numbers, the growth in homeschooling was larger than the growth in private school enrollment. Our data indicate that for every one newly enrolled child in a public school, there were nearly two enrolled in homeschooling, even in that 21-22 school year, again, when schools were back in person. And homeschool enrollment explains over a quarter of the public school enrollment loss. And as an aside, we can say more about this in the Q&A. This is an information lacuna, because we know so little about the homeschooling sector, kind of by design. I mean, they're outside all of the usual data systems we have. And the usual sources we do rely on, surveys from the federal government, just haven't caught up with this population yet. Okay, so here's a little graphic from the AP that breaks down what I just showed you in terms of where, say, a representative group of 1,000 students have gone. What looks to me as blue is the private school. The group below them in kind of orange is homeschool enrollment. The purple is the demographic change in the population. But then notice what we're seeing below that on the next slide. This gray group is a substantial tranche of students where we see public school enrollment loss that cannot be explained by the run-up in private school and homeschooling and the demographic change we could document. So going to the next slide, this raises a really interesting question. Where are these, I'll put in quotes, missing kids? I say missing kids provisionally. It's not that we, can't actually find these kids, but the more awkward way to say it is it's public school enrollment declines that cannot be explained by observed increases in non-public school enrollment, private and homeschooling, and demographic change. Okay, so what could explain this? Well, there are at least three explanations for why this might occur. One is the kids are there in the population data, but they're truants, right? They're not in the public school. They're part of a public school enrollment loss because they're simply not attending school, or they're actually in unregistered homeschooling. So they've left the public school sector, but they haven't shown up in homeschooling numbers because they simply didn't tell the state that that's what they were doing. And then another possibility is that the kids are there in the population, not in the public school enrollment numbers, because they're in a state where kindergarten attendance isn't mandatory, or even where it is, but they're simply not going. They're skipping kindergarten. And each of these hypotheses, none of which are mutually exclusive, has implications for childhood well-being. I'll note quickly as an aside, I find indirect support for that third hypothesis, unexplained losses, in that unexplained public school enrollment losses are really concentrated in the states where kindergarten is not required. So that is kind of indirect evidence that skipping kindergarten might be a part of what's going on here. And again, I would just underscore that could matter for child development, because there's a lot of literature about the developmental plasticity of really young children and the importance of high quality learning environments for their long-term educational and economic success. Okay, with all that as background, let's pivot to discuss what we're doing about this. What's the character of academic recovery efforts in the US? And one of the important things to note is there's been a massive federal investment in education to support academic recovery. Under ESSER, the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, the federal government has allocated about $190 billion to US schools. But what are we seeing about that? Well, There's a lot of concern for a number of reasons. I mean, one is that there's not great transparency about how those funds are being spent. And in many states, a lot of those resources, even today, are unspent. At the same time, the opportunity to spend that money is going to run out soon. All ESSER funds are required to be obligated towards specific spending by next September. And this you'll often hear referred to as the fiscal cliff. Now, again, these resources are meant to help schools, you know, improve their ventilation systems and address learning loss. But there's concern that many districts, particularly those with declining enrollment, are using these resources simply to prop up budgets that have fewer dollars now that there are fewer students, so that they don't have to lay off students or uh, 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 close schools. Okay, so that's a concern that as the money runs out, that schools are going to have a kind of financial reckoning that might put pressure on them to close schools, something may want to discuss further. What do we know about how the money is being spent? Well, the most popular spending target, and this is from survey data I can point you to, is in terms of trying to address learning loss, is districts are putting a lot of money on expanded learning time in the summer and providing tutoring, and as well as kind of specialist student support staff. I will note that there's mixed evidence on the quality of these efforts. Many school states and districts find it's difficult to implement these kinds of new procedures well, and correspondingly, we're seeing mixed evidence on their impact. But I also want to underscore where the spending for learning loss has been least popular. The surveys of school business, a prominent survey of school business officials indicates they are much less likely to spend these resources on early childhood programs and community outreach to assess family needs. I want to underscore this, given that we've seen the largest disruptions in learning environments among younger children. And I haven't even said anything about pre-K enrollment, which also fell dramatically over this period. In state-run pre-K programs, a decade of enrollment gains were wiped out during the pandemic. Second, the reason the low levels of spending on community outreach matters is what I showed you earlier on about the sharp run-ups in chronic absenteeism. You could be running the best-in-class tutoring programs, but if your most vulnerable learners aren't there to take it up because they're chronically absent, that's a problem. And you can't expect those programs to address their needs, and they may actually exacerbate inequality in learning. So in the next slide, I'll discuss this as a larger phenomenon. And you can see me unpackage this argument a little more in an op-ed that's on the website I'll link you to. I argue that our academic recovery effort suffer from a bias known as a streetlight effect. If you may be familiar with this old joke about someone who loses their keys and a police officer comes along to offer them help them find their keys as they're searching under a streetlight, and at one point asks, "Where did you lose your keys?" And the person says, "Over there in the dark." And the police officer asks, "Why are you looking here?" And the response is, "Because the light is brighter." And so this joke is sometimes used to underscore a kind of cognitive bias that can occur, where our attention is drawn to where the data are most illuminating, most readily available. And that can create a bias because that isn't necessarily where the phenomenon we should be concerned about are occurring. So in particular in this context, the enrollment data are indicating that the biggest disruptions to learning environments are at the pre-K and kindergarten level, and also among truant and chronically absent and homeschooled children. But the concern I've articulated is our academic recovery efforts aren't really privileging them in what we're doing. They're not paying as much attention to the kids we don't see in the readily available data. And this is not to say we shouldn't be doing expanded summer learning opportunities or tutoring. I think we should pay attention to the kids still in front of us in public schools, but particularly if we want to address the equity implications of the pandemic for learning, we need much more attention on the kids who aren't in those classrooms, who might be truant, who might be chronically absent. And I also want to underscore for these younger kids, that fall 2020 decline in kindergarten enrollment, that class of kindergarten students, among those who started kindergarten, aren't going to enter third grade until next year, the 23-24 school year. So they won't even begin to show up in most testing windows until then. And the kids who delayed kindergarten it'll be another year before they're in those testing windows. So we're not going to see them in the data system. They're outside the street light, but it's something I think we should certainly investigate further, given what the enrollment data are telling us. Okay, so let me conclude, and then we could step back, for Q&A. I would argue there's a need for a sustained sense of urgency in academic recovery and in realizing the intellectual potential of children who have clearly been substantially harmed by the pandemic. I'm also concerned about whether our educational institutions are prepared to support academic recovery, given the imminent fiscal cliff that's going to diminish the resources that are available to them. And then the overlaying issue is that as those resources recede, schools that have seen dramatic enrollment declines are going to face substantial pressure to close under-enrolled schools and maybe lay off staff. We're already seeing this in some communities. And we know from prior experiences, school closures are highly controversial, really painful events that rend at the fabric of communities and create real risk, particularly for historically vulnerable students who are the ones most likely to be shifted around to new schools. A third point I would stress is just the critical need for better data. Again, to understand the different challenges that all kids face, not just the kids we see most readily in the current data systems we have. And I would add as a coda to this, I think this is where there are real opportunities for journalists to serve the public good by telling the stories that are hidden from us right now. Overlaying all of this, I think, is an obligation to be prepared for what may come in terms of future public health challenges. So I'll stop there, but go to the final slide where I can share with you a link to everything I've discussed here, the research articles, the op-eds, the reporting by the New York Times and the Associated Press, my companion research. If you go to dee.stanford.edu, it'll take you to my GitHub site that has all of that information, and this QR code will take you there as well. So I hope I hit the time fairly well, and I'll stop sharing slide deck on this end and look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much for these remarks. I want to ask a quick question before I jump to the audience. I'd like to probe a bit more deeply into the kindergarten loss aspect. As I was telling one of our speakers yesterday, I was really in the room when the conversations around 0 to 3 and Carnegie Foundation investing millions of dollars into getting the general public to understand that 0 to 3 were the most important years and we have to invest early. The statistics around kids not returning to kindergarten or even going is very troubling to me. And so at first I wanted to ask, how many states don't require kindergarten?
Yeah, I've got that breakdown for the states, which were part of the AP data collection catchment we did. I want to say it's about half, but I can point you to where there's hard data of this. There's a group called the Education Commission of the States, and it's linked to it in my Where the Kids Went report that's on my GitHub site. The Education Commission of the States reports data state by state on whether they require kindergarten. I want to say it's about half, but it might be slightly more imbalanced. And again, I would underscore that we don't see the missing kid phenomenon in the states that require kids to show up in kindergarten, which again argues that many families into that second year of the pandemic where they could said, you know what, you don't have to go to kindergarten. Let's just skip that year. And that creates a loss of learning opportunity for students. And I would also stress, I haven't said enough about teachers as well. That creates learning challenges for teachers who are seeing very different kids who might be showing up in their classrooms in the wake of the pandemic. And I also didn't stress there are reports of increasing stress among teachers. We haven't seen that result in increased teacher turnover until this very moment. Number of states are reporting teacher turnover statistics for the current moment, and we're just now seeing sharp increases there that suggest there might be staffing challenges as a result of the stress teachers are experiencing.
So, in your estimation, have we simply lost incredibly valuable ground in the public conversation about early learning? It seemed that we had achieved so much in terms of getting the public to understand that we need to invest in the early years. Did COVID sort of drive one of the final nails into that effort?
Yeah, I do have that as a concern. I mean, I think you're right that there had been a growing public awareness about what a propitious opportunity early childhood is. There's such a plasticity to child development. There was evidence from seminal early studies that may be known to you and others, preschool, abecedarian, about what substantial, outsized, and long-lived impact high quality early childhood care can have. But I think, yeah, the pandemic has drawn attention away from that because we've been having generic discussions about how do we promote academic recovery among the kids in public schools. Our attention has been drawn to where the test scores have been telling us about those kids, and those testing windows are typically grades 3 through 8, and they've been focused on our efforts at high dosage tutoring and expanded summer research programs. And again, I don't want to deprecate those efforts. I think they're important, and we do want to serve those kids who are showing up. But I think it has biased us away from thinking about where we've seen substantial disruptions in the enrollment data. That's among young kids, and that's among the kids who aren't even in the building to take up tutoring or to take up summer learning programs.
Okay, let's start here.
Thank you very much for your time. My name is Mary Flum. I'm a national producer with NBC News. I've spent the pandemic covering a lot of these topics, overseeing 3 weeks of cross-platform coverage in NBC News called Kids Under Pressure, where we looked specifically at these topics that you're talking about the kids kind of getting lost in the shuffle. A couple of things that you've noted and that we found in our coverage, I just wanted to get your thoughts. One, when you're talking about, absolutely, we've been looking at the mental health issues of kids, which had been an issue, as you noted, even before the pandemic. But what's fascinating is the lack of resources of the child psychologists, the child psychiatrists, and the school guidance counselors, which there doesn't seem to be a movement in that. I mean, we know that there's a dearth of that population, and there's such long waiting lists for these kids to get the help they need. And I was curious about kind of your thoughts on where we're at, if the needle is moving at all forward. A second question I had in terms of resources is you started to address, it's the teachers, right? These master teachers that are retiring or stepping down and stepping away in increasing droves. We did a full 2 weeks of coverage going into this academic year, looking at the impact that these teachers leaving are having on the classrooms. And I'm just wondering if folks are specifically, it sounds like you're starting to track that and the impact. The last question I had that I thought was really interesting, it has to do with the homeschooling. And we found that as well, that homeschooling is on the rise, especially like some of these education pods where parents have just decided for political or religious, racial issues, there's all kinds of reasons that they're stepping away. And it's not traditional homeschooling. There's maybe no traditional homeschooling anymore, but they're forming their own pods. And interestingly, some of them are hiring teachers. They're hiring teachers who've stepped away from the system. It's almost like they're forming, it seems like there's a small but growing almost groundswell of these pods. I was intrigued to hear that you're not, that folks aren't able to track those yet. But I'm wondering if there's any efforts in the works of dialoguing with these folks, because if those folks have left, there had but once been the supposition that these folks might come back, and it doesn't seem that they're going to. So I'm wondering if there are efforts to communicate with those groups that have left, as you noted, 30% uptick, and there's some anecdotal evidence that number may continue to rise.
Yeah, those three great questions. So let me take each in turn. Like first on public health resources. I've heard similar anecdotes about just how we've got an inadequate supply of therapists, mental health specialists to support the increased demand. I don't know that I've seen hard data on it, so there might be some important reporting opportunities there. And I would just underscore two things. I mean, one is, given that lack of supply, we're likely to see troubling inequality in who gets access to the mental health supports they need. And a second point I would make is that in a world where they're kind of like a scarce and kind of inelastic supply, at least in the short term, it might make sense for us to think of better alternatives that it might involve mediation through technology or use of group sessions or things of that sort. And I think this also has implications for what happens if we have to shut down again. And we might want to, as a group, I'd be happy to say more about my thoughts on the current debate about that. But let me pivot to your second question, comment about teachers leaving. I think this is a story where we have to be kind of subtle, because there's often you'll hear rhetoric around teacher shortages, and a lot of that confounds just long-term systemic problems of staffing particular subjects like special education and STEM fields and hard to staff schools, and obscures the fact that historically we've had enough general elementary school teachers. Shortages have been less of an issue there. Sometimes that all gets conflated. And at the same time, we're anticipating many districts now are going to face fiscal pressure that might lead them to want to lay off teachers. At a moment, there's also this discussion of teacher shortages. So I just want to say sometimes I find the public discussion of this isn't entirely coherent, because some places are facing shortages. Some places are going to be facing pressure to lay off teachers. It can vary by school. Is it a historically hard to staff school? It can vary by subject. So I just want to underscore that kind of nuance and heterogeneity by space that I think is an important part of what's going on with teachers right now. Third, on homeschooling. Yeah, it's by nature such a difficult question. I mean, some of the most granular data we get on homeschooling is from a national federal survey. I believe it's called the National Household Education Survey, and it's simply not available past 2019 right now. So, and it tells us something about homeschooling families before the pandemic that roughly accords with the kind of stereotypes we might have, more likely to be white, rural, coming from large families. There's little reason to think those patterns necessarily generalize to what happened during the pandemic, as you noted, with many of the families perhaps being more affluent or being in pods. I also hear many anecdotes from African-American families that like homeschooling or were happier with remote-only schooling than other families because of how classroom environments were often seen as hostile to Black families. So having some oversight through remote-only schooling or having other options had a particular appeal. And also, there is this continuum. At what point does a homeschool become a private school? I'll note here in California, they actually don't make a formal distinction. What they do is, whether you're homeschooling or in a private school, the state asks you to file an affidavit so they can track the enrollment. And then they use informally a designation if there are 5 or fewer kids in your school, be it a homeschool or an official private school, that they can, they informally consider that homeschooling. I was just able to get from my AP partners in the state of California their homeschooling data for the current year. And there was a continued decline. It's still well above pre-pandemic levels, but it sounds as if some of the homeschooling parents have returned. But what's going on in other states, we don't know. And I want to stress that the sharp run up in homeschooling that we documented may well understate the degree to which this occurred, because we were only able to gather data from states that reported homeschooling enrollment. Many other states wouldn't even collect the enrollment data. And these are states where there are lower barriers to entry to running homeschooling. So we might expect the increase in homeschooling there was even larger. So, and we just simply don't know what's going on there. What is the character of different homeschooling? What kind of curriculum and learning opportunities are available to students? You mentioned the continuum from homeschooling to private schooling, but we might also worry about a continuum that runs from homeschooling to truancy if the learning opportunities in homeschooling aren't very strong. And simply by design, it's just not an area where we know very much and where I think reporting is particularly important.
So from an evidence standpoint, I wonder how long it will take for researchers like you to be able to present a body of evidence to officials, to policymakers, to get it to actually move the needle and have some of the necessary adjustments made.
Yeah, I think this brings me back to the comments about the data systems, because you know, as a kind of quantitative researcher, I can't run ahead of the data that's available to me. And it was the crisis around the lack of in-time data that drove us to do this, the kind of bespoke data collection I've been describing, which admittedly, I mean, I think is really important, but is admittedly focused only on the most crude indicators, simply just trying to track where kids are, private school, homeschool, public school, have they shifted, moved states, et cetera. So my kind of cri de coeur would be, we need better, more timely data systems. And it's frankly frustrating in a period of history where I know within minutes of when a package has been dropped outside my door that we can't have more timely and accurate information on what our kids are experiencing. So it has to start there. The only other, like, you know, if I could light a candle rather than curse the darkness, there may be opportunities through the kinds of partnerships many researchers have with major school districts to get earlier access to the kinds of data they have. But again, they only have the data they have, and they may be missing data on some of the kids we want to track. So we need state and federal leadership for timely, actionable data to help us navigate this crisis.
And then one other question that I had, at our first Future of the American Child training, we had someone from New Mexico who came and talked about the initiative, the actual legislation that created funding for early childhood education and care, early child care anyway. So what are your thoughts about the potential for legislated initiatives to try to recover some of the ground that we talked about earlier in terms of early education, the need to make sure that kids have access to quality care and quality education?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would love to be proven wrong, and I'm not, you know, qualified tea reader of politics, but the budget discussions I'm seeing in Washington currently don't make me feel optimistic that the kinds of resources the federal government has been making available for education during the pandemic are going to continue. So I'd be happy to be proven wrong on that, because I think all the available data suggests that there's an extraordinarily high sort of benefit to cost return from investing in early childhood. But I don't know in the current budget climate that the federal government is poised to make those kinds of investments. But if we saw compelling cases of states doing that and seeing success, that might help create that kind of motivation.
I guess I'll ask one final question then, and that is the initiative between Stanford and what is the big data, the coalition based on Stanford. What's the name of it again? Tell me, I'm sorry.
There's a group here at Stanford run by my colleague Cheryl Phillips, who used to report for the Seattle Times, called Big Local News.
Big
And I
Local
think
News.
biglocalnews.org is their website. And so she and her colleagues really try to help journalists write data-infused stories by making a variety of data readily available through their website. And so they've been fabulous partners through this project and the ongoing work we're hoping to do.
So clearly you know about the erosion of local news and the news deserts, that conversation that's going on around the country. Would you say that education is the ultimate local news story that is in danger in terms of if we lose people covering these topics, we lose a lot in our communities?
I think that's right, but I would also say that that is something that can perhaps help invigorate local reporting, right? Because we have such a decentralized federalist system of public schooling. And people forget this, like sometimes when I talk about what's going on with US public schools, there's such extraordinary heterogeneity across states. And within those 50 states, there are over 13,000 local school districts. And there's a reason when you're buying real estate, one of the first things they'll advertise a property beyond its the number of bedrooms, bathrooms, and square footage on the lot is the schools with which it's aligned. People are really attuned to that aspect of their local community. So I think it's a part of local reporting that can continue to attract attention because it's so important to families and because of how it serves their children and how it's embedded in what for most of us is our most important financial asset, the home we own.
Great. Well, thank you so much for expanding my thinking about this education issue in our country today. And I'm sure the journalists, the fellows in the program will be reaching out to you for more guidance and insight along the way. So let's take this opportunity to show Thomas Dee our appreciation for joining us today.